Hello everyone, I'm MANO and
And I'm here to help you today. I know you watched this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me where you're from and what time you're watching this. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Marcus Webb, and what I'm about to tell you happened in late September of last year, in the Linville Gorge Wilderness in Burke County, North Carolina. I've gone back and forth about writing this down. My therapist says it's part of processing. My girlfriend, Delia, says the opposite, says dragging it into words will only make it live longer. But Delia hasn't been the same since we came back from Linville, and I'm starting to think that if I don't write it down now, I'll lose the edges of it to the way the brain smooths over the things it can't explain. I need the edges. I need to remember exactly. We were 3 people who went in, 2 came out. And one of us, the one sitting across from me at my kitchen table right now, drinking chamomile tea and blinking at the wrong times, I'm not sure I know anymore. Part 1. What we were before Owen Trent was the one who suggested Linville. He'd been going on about it for the better part of 2 years, since he'd day-hiked Table Rock with some co-workers in 2022 and come back describing the gorge like a man who'd seen God through a crack in the earth. It's the Grand Canyon of the East, he told us maybe a dozen times, waving his beer. Except nobody goes. No cell service. No amenities. Just 400 miles of trail and vertical drops that'll make your knees forget who they are. Owen was 36. He'd been my closest friend since our sophomore year at NC State. The kind of friendship built more on shared silences than conversations, on camping trips and long drives and the particular ease of 2 people who don't need to fill every moment. He worked in environmental consulting, which suited him. He knew trees by their bark. He could read weather and the way a creek smelled. He carried a compass when everyone else relied on their phones, not because he was pretentious about it, but because he genuinely believed the compass would outlive the civilization that made the phone. Delia Park was 33, a charge nurse at UNC Medical in Chapel Hill, and she'd been with me for 4 years. She was the kind of person who noticed when the milk was running low 3 days before it ran out and quietly replaced it without saying anything. Calm was her natural register, which I'd needed because mine was anxiety. Not the kind that shows, but the interior variety that hums underneath everything like a bad electrical connection. I'd been claustrophobic since I was 9 years old, when I was trapped for 2 hours under the collapsed roof of a garden shed during a freak ice storm, my father's arm pinning me to the frozen ground until the neighbors heard him screaming. I don't talk about it much. It lives in small spaces, crawl spaces, tents, places where the walls are too close and I can't remember which direction leads out. Delia knew about the shed. She always made sure I was on the outside of the sleeping bag zipper. The plan was simple. 4 days, 3 nights. We'd enter the gorge at the Kistler Memorial Highway trailhead, hike down to the Linville River, set up a base camp on the 2nd day, do a ridge loop on day 3 including Hawksbill Mountain, and exit back out on day 4. Owen had done the permit research, bought the USGS topographic maps, and spent 3 weeks assembling bear-proof food canisters and filtering systems. He sent us a gear list in a shared Google Doc with subtabs. Delia rolled her eyes but packed everything on it. I trusted Owen with my life. That's the part I keep coming back to. Part 2. The first day we left the parking area at 8 in the morning on a Thursday, the air already carrying that particular Appalachian September smell. Leaf rot and pine and something mineral underneath, like cold water over stone. The gorge opened up below us as we hit the ridge trail, and even I, who had been mildly dreading this for weeks, felt the pull of the landscape. The walls of the gorge are sheer in places, dropping 600 feet into the river below. The forest on the slopes is the kind of old-growth eastern hardwood that makes you feel small in a way that cities never manage, because cities are built to remind you of human scale. Out here, the scale was something else entirely. Owen walked point, like always. He had a rolling stride that covered ground efficiently without looking hurried. Delia walked between us, stopping to photograph mushroom clusters and the way lichen covered certain north-facing rocks in thick green-gray pads. I brought up the rear, which I preferred. I liked being able to see both of them ahead of me, liked knowing nobody could come from behind without coming through me first. That's the anxiety talking. I recognize that. We made good time and camped the first night on a flat shelf above the river, about a mile from the confluence with the Linville Falls drainage. Owen got the fire going while Delia and I assembled tents. The sound of the river was constant, a low, rhythmic muttering that was either very calming or the farthest thing from it, depending on what you brought into it with you. It was while we were eating, freeze-dried chili, coffee, a bar of dark chocolate Delia had been rationing, that Owen brought up the Ravenmacher. Cherokee legend, he said, not looking up from the fire. Old one. This whole gorge, the Linville area, the old name for it in the Cherokee tradition, was something like the place where the old ones gather. Can't remember the exact pronunciation. He poured more coffee. The Ravenmacher it's an evil witch, basically. One that's lived so long it's become something else. It flies at night making sounds like a raven, follows dying people, feeds on their hearts, steals whatever years they had left. Cheerful campfire material, Delia said. The thing is, it doesn't just kill, Owen continued. It mimics. It comes as a dying person to fool the people around them. It wears the right face, says the right things. Nobody realizes until it's too late. How do you tell? I asked. He shrugged, poked the fire. Old stories say the eyes are wrong, that the Ravenmacher can copy everything except what's behind the eyes. The fire popped. An ember rode a small updraft and vanished. I want to say I felt something then. Retrospectively, I look for the moment I should have known. But the truth is, it was just a good story around a good fire, and Owen told it in the same dry, matter-of-fact way he told everything, like a man reporting on local ecology. And then Delia changed the subject to hospital staffing ratios, and we went to sleep. Except I didn't sleep well. I woke at least 3 times to sounds I couldn't place. Not the river, something higher in the canopy. A sound like wings that was too large for any bird I knew, and then gone before I could be sure I'd heard it. The 3rd time I woke up, I lay still in the tent with my eyes open, listening. The river kept its tempo. The fire outside had burned down to coals. And then, from somewhere upslope, maybe 200 yards, I heard what I can only describe as a human voice making an inhuman sound. A sound that was almost a word, but not quite. The way you'll sometimes hear a word in rain on a window that resolves when you listen harder into just noise. I lay there until dawn. Part 3. The second day. The GPS quit at roughly the 2-mile mark on our approach to Hawksbill's western shoulder. Owen's Garmin, the serious kind, the kind backpackers trust with their lives in actual backcountry, simply stopped displaying our position. The satellite acquisition bar dropped to 0 and stayed there. He powered it off, held down the restart sequence, waited through the boot screen. It came back up and searched for satellites for 4 minutes before displaying a position that was, according to the topo map, in the middle of the Linville River itself. That's not right, Owen said, with the tone of a man who knows a thing is broken but still believes it can be unbroken through sufficient patience. Signal dropout? Delia asked. In an open ridge section, we should have full sky. He toggled the map settings. The coordinates refreshed. Now the display placed us 14 miles east in a residential neighborhood in Morganton. Okay, he said, and put the Garmin away. We go by compass and topo. Owen was completely competent with a topo map. That wasn't the issue. The issue, and I didn't voice this because it seemed stupid in daylight, was the sense I'd had all morning that the trail was subtly wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not visibly wrong. But I'd been watching the terrain, cross-referencing it the way I do with anxiety, constantly building a mental map of entrance and exit, and there were moments when a ridge feature that should have appeared to our left appeared to our right, or a saddle that the map suggested we'd crossed didn't feel like something we'd crossed. When I mentioned this to Owen, he nodded and said, "Magnetic anomalies. The gorge has old metamorphic rock, gneiss and schist, some of it with significant iron content. It can throw a compass off by a few degrees." Can it throw a GPS off? He considered that. The GPS shouldn't care about magnetic fields, but I've heard about deep valleys with weird satellite geometry, the gorge walls blocking the horizon. We're not in the gorge right now. No, he agreed. We're not. The second strange thing happened around noon. We'd stopped for lunch on a rocky outcrop with a clean view into the upper gorge, Table Rock's distinctive flat summit visible to the north. The river a bright thread 500 feet below. Delia was taking pictures. Owen was adjusting his pack straps. I was eating a protein bar and watching a vulture ride a thermal far below us, which I found mildly comforting, proof of normal predator-prey ecology, animals behaving the way animals should. Then the vulture tilted and flew away, and I noticed something I hadn't consciously registered until it was gone. It was quiet. Not trail quiet, not wind quiet, but wrong quiet. No birds, no insects. The ridge was in full afternoon sun and it was 62 degrees, perfect for the late-season cricket chorus that had followed us all morning. And there was nothing. The sound of the wind in the tree canopy, the sound of my own pulse in my ears and nothing else. Owen, I said. He heard it too, or rather didn't hear it. He was already still, head slightly tilted. Delia lowered her phone. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then a crow called somewhere below us and the forest came back online. The insects first, then the lower birds, like a power grid rebooting in sequence. We didn't talk about it. I think all three of us made an individual decision not to make it larger than it was. That's what you do, I think. You encounter something you can't put into the right category, and you assign it to a smaller, safer category. Sound dropout, atmospheric anomaly, the trail being unusually sheltered, and you move on because moving on is what keeps you functional. What I thought about and didn't say, before the crow called, before the forest came back, I had looked at my own arms and found the hair standing flat. Not raised. Flat and cold, as if something had pressed the temperature out of the air around me all at once. And I'd felt, this is the part that sounds irrational in daylight, I'd felt watched. Not in the way I sometimes feel when my anxiety manufactures a presence behind me, which is a feeling I know and can identify. This was its opposite, a certainty not generated from inside but pressed in from without, the way you know the sun is on your face even with your eyes closed. Something nearby was processing us, counting us. I had no other words for it. Then the crow and the insects and the birds, and we ate our lunch and talked about where we'd camp that night. But I noticed, when we shouldered our packs to continue, that Owen didn't look back down the slope the way he usually did, the habitual scan he always performed, checking for dropped gear, accounting for the landscape. He looked upslope, into the deep tree cover to the north where the canopy was thick enough to hold the dark even at noon. He looked for maybe 3 seconds, with an expression I couldn't read, and then he turned and kept walking. I looked up the slope after him and saw nothing. Just trees. Just shadow between trees. Just the way a forest looks when it's watching you back. The third thing I can date precisely, because Owen had been checking his watch. We reached what he'd identified as our second campsite at what the watch said was 3:47 p.m. We set up camp, collected water from a side creek through the filter, and Owen started the fire. By the time I looked up from my tent stakes, the sky through the canopy was the deep indigo of an hour before dark. "What time is it?" Delia asked. Owen checked. 6:14. 2 hours and 27 minutes had moved through us while we'd been setting up camp. I remember it taking 40 minutes, maybe an hour. Owen's watch was a mechanical, not digital, not connected to anything. It couldn't be hacked or wrong by satellite. Mechanical watches don't gain 2 hours, none of us said anything. But that night Delia held my hand in the tent longer than usual before she fell asleep. And the fire, Owen had built it with birch bark and dry oak splits the way he always did, burned with a core that was, unmistakably, the blue-white of a propane flame rather than the orange of wood. He poured water on it early and didn't comment. Part 4. What happened to Owen? I woke at 2 a.m. to find his side of the outer tent empty. This meant he'd unzipped both the inner mesh layer and the rainfly, and I hadn't heard either. Owen zipped his sleeping bag by habit every night. He'd told me once it was backpacker discipline, always secured against insects. His bag was unzipped, folded back. His boots were gone. His headlamp was gone. His knife was on the ground near his pad, which was the wrong thing to leave behind. I sat for a moment doing the calculation everyone does. Bathroom. He'd gone to pee and took the headlamp because it's sensible. I checked my watch. Delia's, which she'd let me use since mine had died. 2:06 a.m. I listened. Wind. The creek. Something far away that might have been an owl or might not have been. I woke Delia. I don't know why I woke her instead of waiting. I think it was the knife. He went to the bathroom, she said immediately and with certainty, the way tired nurses speak when they're managing a situation. His knife's here. She looked at the knife. He probably just forgot it. Owen doesn't forget his knife. We sat there together in the dark for another 20 minutes, and then she said very quietly, "I'm going to call his name. Delia." Marcus. She called his name twice. The sound of it fell into the dark and nothing came back. We waited another hour. I know because I watched the watch. At 3:11 a.m. the rustling started. From upslope, something moving through underbrush with the particular lack of care that means either a large animal or a person who isn't worried about being heard. Delia reached for her hand and found my wrist instead, her fingers tight. Owen came through the tree line at the north edge of camp. He was walking normally. His headlamp was on his forehead, switched off. There was a long scratch on his left forearm that he was carrying below waist level in a way that suggested he didn't know it was there. His face, and I'm going to try to describe this exactly, his face was arranged correctly. Correct number of features, correct positions, correct coloring. But there was a quality to his expression that I can only describe as the expression of a man who has forgotten for one moment what his expression is supposed to be, and is working to reconstitute it from memory. "Hey," he said. His voice was Owen's voice. "Sorry, couldn't sleep. Went for a walk." "For an hour?" Delia asked. "Was it that long?" He touched the scratch on his arm, then looked at it like he was noticing it for the first time. "I fell. On some rocks." He said this without affect, without the slight wince or dismissive laugh that a person actually uses when they describe falling. "Come look at that in the light," Delia said. She had her headlamp on now and was doctor mode, practical, reaching for the first aid kit. He let her clean the wound. He watched her do it with an expression that I am going to call interested, not the stoic, mild discomfort of a man tolerating first aid. Something more attentive than that, like he was studying how it was done. "Does that hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. Then, a beat later, "A little." He went back to his sleeping bag and was asleep, apparently immediately and completely, within minutes. I watched his chest rise and fall. Normal rhythm. Normal man sleeping. My best friend of 14 years. I didn't sleep again that night. Part 5. The third day in the morning he was Owen again, mostly. He made coffee the way he always did, in the titanium percolator he refused to leave home without. He talked about the weather. We had a system coming in from the southwest, he said. Probably by evening we should do Hawksbill in the morning and be back in camp before it arrived. He ate 2 packets of oatmeal. He laughed at something Delia said about a patient she'd had last month, but he didn't mention going off in the night. Not an apology, not a revisitation, not even the residual self-consciousness a person carries when they've worried their companions. It was gone. I waited for him to bring it up and he didn't, and when I said, "How's your arm?" he said, "Fine," and showed me the scratch, and it was clean and healing. Already healing faster than the night before, which I filed in the part of my mind I was trying to keep logical. He didn't blink right. I noticed it on the hike up to Hawksbill. That human blink rate, which I had never consciously tracked in anyone before, is semi-irregular. We blink between 12 and 20 times a minute, but not at even intervals. We blink more when we're processing language, less when we're focused on visual tasks. Owen's blinks that morning were timed, metronomic, one every 4 to 5 seconds, consistent as a metronome. I counted. I stopped counting because counting made me feel like I was losing my mind. The Hawksbill summit is 420 feet and exposed, a granite bald with a clean 360-degree view of the gorge and the surrounding wilderness. Normally, Owen would have spent 20 minutes up there naming peaks, pointing out creek drainages. That morning, he stood at the edge of the summit for 30 seconds, looked south and said, "We should go back down." "We just got here," Delia said. "Storm's coming faster." He pointed at a cloud bank to the southwest that was, in fairness, building, but it was 9:30 in the morning. The storm he'd predicted for evening was hours out. "I want to be back before it hits." Delia looked at me. I looked at Owen. "Okay," I said. Because what was I going to say? We found the cave on the way down. It wasn't on any of the topo maps, which I was tracking by hand now since the GPS was still useless. It appeared on the western face of the Hawksbill Approach Trail, a horizontal crack in the gneiss about 4 feet tall and maybe 8 feet wide, going back into darkness, the kind of feature that's easy to miss if you're not looking. Owen found it. He stopped on the trail with a directness that felt less like discovery and more like arrival. "Look at that," he said. I did not want to look at it. The aperture, the stone pressing in on both sides, the dark going back. My body knew what it was before my brain did, and my body did not want to be here. I stepped back 2 paces. Automatic. "It's just a cave," Delia said because she knows me. "I know," I said. What I did not know was whether she'd noticed what I was looking at just inside the mouth of the cave, where the afternoon light barely reached. Symbols carved into the stone. Not petroglyphs. These weren't the ancient hand-pecked marks of the Cherokee sites I'd seen in photographs. These were cut with something sharp, and cut recently. The edges still pale and fresh against the dark rock face. They were geometric but organic, circles overlapping circles with lines radiating from the intersections, and in the center of the largest grouping, a shape I recognized from Owen's description the first night. A bird. Specifically, a raven. Its wings folded against its body, its head turned to regard whoever stood at the mouth of the cave. "Owen," I said. He was already inside. "Owen." My voice did something I didn't intend. It cracked. "Come back out of there." A pause. Then his headlamp came on, a white circle of light swinging across the cave wall. "There are more in here," he called back. "The symbols. They go all the way to the back. Come out." Delia's voice now, not gentle. Nurse voice. "Owen, come out of the cave." He came out. He stood in the light and looked at the carved raven at the cave entrance and said, "Someone was here not long ago." He traced the edge of one of the freshly cut circles with his finger. "A week, maybe less." "Who?" I asked, though I didn't want an answer. "Someone who knows the stories," he said. He looked at me then, and his eyes were Owen's eyes, pale blue, slightly crow-footed at the corners. But behind them was that quality I'd been trying to name since he came back from the woods at 3 a.m. A flatness. A watching quality, like looking at a screen that's showing you the right footage but the room the screen is in is wrong. "Let's go back to camp," Delia said. He smiled. "Yes," he said. "Let's." Part 6. The storm. The storm hit camp before we did. By the time we came down off the Hawksbill Approach, the wind was moving hard through the upper canopy, and the light had gone the specific flat gray of an overcast afternoon, where the sun is already low behind clouds. Our camp was intact, tents staked, bear canisters sealed. But when Delia opened her pack to get her rain jacket, she stopped. "Marcus." I came and looked. Her food supply, the freeze-dried meals, the energy bars, the vacuum-packed trail mix she'd sorted into individual bags, was spoiled. I don't mean stale. I mean that the sealed pouches had somehow compromised, that the contents were dark and wet and smelling of something biological and wrong. The trail mix bags had burst. The thing inside them was matted and black, like something that had been wet for weeks. "That was all sealed yesterday," she said. "I know. This doesn't happen to sealed food in 24 hours. I know." Owen was behind us. I heard him rather than saw him, a soft sound that I realized when I turned was him humming. Just barely audible, low in his throat, a sound without melody. He looked at Delia's ruined food and said, "We have enough between Marcus and me for all three of us. We'll ration." "Owen," Delia said, "what is happening? To the food?" "To everything. The GPS, the time, you disappearing last night, now this." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. "Something's off about this place." He said it with perfect Owen reasonableness, the flat declarative tone he used for trail conditions and weather forecasts. "We should leave in the morning, early." "We should leave now," I said. "In the dark? In a storm?" He pointed at the sky, where the first drops were already finding the canopy. "We'd be on a scree slope in the rain with no GPS. We leave at first light." He was right. That was the terrible part. The logic was Owen's logic. The reasoning was sound, and I had no way to argue with the content of what he was saying while being certain in the marrow of my bones that the person saying it was not Owen. Part 7. The long night I did not sleep. I sat in the tent with my back against Delia's sleeping bag and my eyes on the tent door. Rain came in waves against the fly, hard and cold. The wind moved through the gorge in a sound I can only describe as breathing. A long, slow inhalation through the trees. A pause. An exhalation that shook the poles and drove the rain sideways. Owen's tent was 6 feet from ours, visible through the mesh inner wall as a dark shape lit intermittently by lightning. My claustrophobia works like this. It isn't the space itself that breaks me. It's the arithmetic of exit. I'm always in a small space, doing the calculation. How many moves, how many seconds to be outside? A bedroom is fine because I know the door. A tent I'd set up myself should be fine for the same reason. But that night the geometry of the tent felt different than it had the 2 nights before. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling seemed lower, and the calculation of exit kept returning the same answer. The door is there and something may be on the other side of it, and so the door is not an exit. I focused on breathing, on the sound of the rain, on the weight of Delia beside me. Delia, to her credit, did not try to manage me. She just stayed close. At some point she took my hand again and said very quietly, "He's not Owen." "I know," I said. "What do we do?" "We wait for light." "And if it doesn't wait for light?" I didn't answer, because I didn't have an answer. The rain hit the tent. The gorge breathed, and Owen's tent held its dark, still shape like something that has stopped pretending to be occupied. At 11:40, Owen's tent went still, not the still of sleeping. I'd been watching it shift slightly with his movement, the way tents do when someone inside them breathes and shifts weight. It went the still of empty. I touched Delia's shoulder. She was already awake. I could tell by the quality of her stillness, a nurse is awake, pretending to sleep. "He's gone again," I whispered. "I know," she said. "Delia, I need to tell you something." I told her what I'd been watching. The blinks, the scratch healing, the way he'd looked at her when she cleaned the wound, the thing behind his eyes that wasn't Owen. She was quiet for a long time. The rain moved over us. Then she said, "He came back from the woods and told me his mother's name was Margaret. His mother's name is Carol. I know he told me Margaret. He said it in the middle of telling me something else and then moved on, like he hadn't said it. We sat with that. We have to leave right now," I said. "We're on a scree slope in the dark in a storm." "I know what I'm on." We were both whispering. Delia reached over and took my hand. Her hand was cold. "What do you think it is?" she said. Not a question exactly. "I think he met something in the woods," I said, "and I think it came back with him." "Lightning," In the white flash of it, I saw through the tent wall the silhouette of a man standing in the rain 20 feet upslope, standing completely still, facing our tent. The lightning lasted half a second, and then the dark came back, and I had only the after image. A standing shape, wrong proportions, shoulders too high or arms too long, I couldn't be sure. "Did you see?" "Yes," Delia said. We sat in the dark for a long time. The rain slowed. The wind dropped. And then from outside the tent, in Owen's voice, the exact register of it, the mid-range baritone, the particular way he elides his R's, came the sound of my name. "Marcus." I did not answer. Delia's nails were in my wrist. "Marcus, I heard something. Did you hear that?" The thing that was Owen's voice was close. 3 feet from the tent door. I could hear the wet sound of feet on saturated ground. "Delia?" Owen's voice. "Are you awake?" I pulled Delia back toward the rear of the tent, away from the door. The tents were double-walled. I pressed against the inner mesh and felt the rain fly against my back through it and kept moving. "I'm going to check the lines," Owen's voice said, conversationally, as if we'd been having a conversation. "Storm's passing. Go back to sleep." Silence. Then, from further away, 10 yards, 20. A sound that was not Owen's voice and not any human voice. A sound that occupied the frequency range of human speech but wasn't organized into language. A raw syllabic thing that rose and fell in what might have been pitch, if pitch required a throat. Delia pressed her face against my shoulder. She was shaking. I had never seen her shake. Part 8. What it did to Delia. He came back at 4 a.m. I know because I was watching the time with an obsessive precision that had pushed past fear into something that felt like crystalline calm. Delia was beside me, awake, both of us sitting up with our backs to the inner wall facing the tent door. The tent zipper opened. It opened slowly. The way you open a zipper when you don't want to wake someone. I watched the teeth separate in the dark, and then the flap opened and Owen came in. His headlamp was off. His hair and jacket were wet with rain. His face in the ambient dark was Owen's face. The narrow jaw, the deep-set eyes, the scar through his left eyebrow from a climbing fall in 2019. He settled onto his sleeping pad cross-legged, and he looked at us looking at him and he said, "You should sleep." "Where did you go?" I asked. "I heard something in the trees. I went to look." "What did you find?" "Nothing." He smiled. Owen had a slow smile. It started at the left corner of his mouth and took a beat to complete itself. This smile appeared whole all at once, like a flag dropped. "Nothing," he said again. "Owen." My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. "Tell me your mother's name." Something shifted in his face. The smile stayed, but the eyes changed. That inward shift, a recalculation. "Carol," he said. "Tell me something else. The first time we went camping, where?" "Pisgah Forest," he said immediately. "We were 22. You burned every piece of the food and we ate crackers for 2 days." Every fact correct. I felt the floor under me tilt. The horror of correct facts delivered by something I no longer trusted. "Owen," he lunged. Not like a person crosses a tent. Like a thing removes the space between itself and a target. He was on Delia in the time it takes to blink. His hands on her shoulders, his face close to hers, and the sound that came out of him was the sound from the woods. That non-language. That frequency that didn't belong in a human chest. Delia screamed. I grabbed the back of his jacket and pulled with everything I had, and for one terrible second he didn't move. Held the ground with a mass and inertia that was wrong for a 175-pound man. And then I found the tent wall and pushed through it, the stakes pulling from the saturated earth, the rain fly collapsing, and we rolled out into the cold mud and the dark. Delia was behind me. I could hear her. I had one thought. Move. Move now. Move until there's enough distance that you can think about what to do next. We ran. The trail was mud and darkness, and I had my headlamp, and Delia had hers, and we ran the way people run when they believe that stopping means dying. Without strategy, without thought, down the slope toward the sound of the river. I could hear behind us movement in the brush, keeping pace. Not panicked movement, not the crashing pursuit of something that has lost control. Methodical, like something that could track in the dark and wasn't in a hurry because it was certain. The scratch on Delia's shoulder, where Owen had grabbed her, where his nails had caught, was bleeding through her jacket. She ran without acknowledging it. I noticed it at the trailhead parking area, under the weak cone of a utility light, where we arrived at first gray dawn after 2 hours of river trail hiking that I remember only as a series of sounds: water, mud, my own breathing, and that patient movement in the trees parallel to the trail that stayed with us until the last mile, when it stopped. Part 9. After the ranger who met us at the parking area was a young woman named Vasquez, who'd been alerted by the automated check-in system that our overnight permits were overdue. She took one look at us, Delia's shoulder, my face, the state of us, and made a call. We gave our statements. I gave mine carefully, leaving out the things that would make her look at me differently. I said Owen had gone missing in the night. I said he'd been behaving erratically before he disappeared. I said there was a possibility of a mental health episode, which I hated saying, hated the small betrayal of it, but it was the language that would mobilize resources fastest. I did not say. Something came back from the woods wearing my friend's face and lunged at my girlfriend, and we ran 2 hours in the dark, because we were certain that if we stopped, we wouldn't survive. I said he was missing. I said we needed help. Search and rescue went in that afternoon. They found our campsite, both tents. Owen's tent had been torn down the seam from inside, not cut, torn, the nylon ripped by a force applied from within. His sleeping bag, his pack, his compass, his topographic maps, everything was there. His Garmin, which still wouldn't acquire satellites at the campsite according to the SAR team leader, who found this notable but not inexplicable. His percolator, still full of cold coffee. His knife untouched on the ground. They found a scattering of feathers in a radius around the camp. Raven feathers, forensics said, though no one could explain why a raven would leave that many feathers in a campsite. They found the cave on the Hawksbill approach with the carved symbols. A cultural resources officer photographed them and sent them to 2 university departments. One responded that they matched no known indigenous tradition and were likely recent. The other didn't respond at all. They did not find Owen. 46 volunteers and a drone grid covered the gorge for 11 days. They found nothing. Not his body. Not his boots. Not his voice. The gorge kept him the way the gorge keeps water. Absolutely, without remainder. The case is open. His family, his mother, Carol, who flew in from Raleigh and sat in my living room for 4 hours and never once raised her voice, is waiting. She thanks me when she calls, which I don't understand and can't bear, and the calls are getting less frequent now, and I think that's the particular cruelty of time, that it loosens even the most necessary griefs. Delia's shoulder healed, as I said, faster than it should have. She's been staying at my apartment for 3 months, which at first was practical. She needed support, and so did I. And we are together, and it made sense. The nightmares slowed. The appetite came back. She started sleeping through the night again. Except, she doesn't blink right. I noticed it 2 weeks ago. That metronome quality. 1 blink every 4 to 5 seconds, consistent, measured. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself I was looking for it because I was damaged, because the gorge had broken something in the pattern-matching part of my brain. Last Thursday she was cooking dinner and I came into the kitchen quietly and she didn't hear me. And for a moment I watched her back, her posture, the way she moved at the stove, the rhythm of it. And I had to go out on the balcony and put my hands on the railing and breathe until the feeling passed. I went back inside. I watched her plate the food. I watched her turn and smile at me, the right smile, her smile, starting at the left corner, slow to complete itself. Owen's smile started on the right. I keep telling myself I have this right. I keep telling myself I know which side the smile starts on, that it's hers, that she's here, that the thing that wasn't Owen stayed in the gorge. I keep holding on to the specific geometry of her face, all its familiar landmarks, checking them like a man reading a map in failing light. There's one thing I can't resolve, and I go over it at night when she's sleeping beside me, and the apartment is quiet and the sound of the city replaces the sound of the river. On the night we ran, that long 2-hour push down the gorge in the dark, I'd grabbed her hand and kept it the whole way. She squeezed back at the moments when I squeezed, when the sounds in the trees were close. But there was a minute, maybe less, near the river crossing where the trail dropped into darkness and I needed both hands for the scramble, and I let go. I let go and scrambled down and turned and reached back up for her. The hand that took mine in the dark was cold. She's always cold. She runs cold, always has. I know this. I've known this for 4 years. A cold hand means nothing. But her hands were warm for the first hour of our running. I felt it, the heat of panic and exertion, the living heat of a woman who was terrified and moving fast through wet Appalachian forest in September. They were warm. At the scramble, they were cold, immediately cold, as if the warmth had simply stopped. I sleep facing the door now. I always check the knife is where I left it. I love her. I'm almost certain I love her, and that she is here, and that what happened in the gorge was done with when we left the gorge, and that Owen's disappearance is a tragedy with an explanation I don't yet have, and that my brain, my anxious, pattern-seeking, once-trapped-in-a-shed brain, is working against me. Almost certain. Last night she asked me what Owen's mother's name was. She said it the way you ask a question you already know the answer to. The way Delia always asked questions. Practically, contextually, building to something. Carol, I said. She nodded, just barely, and she looked at the wall for a moment with that quality in her eyes, and then she turned and smiled and said she was tired and went to bed. And I sat at this table and started writing this down. My name is Marcus Webb. We went in 3. We came out 2. And if you're reading this and something feels wrong with the person next to you, now look at the eyes. Don't look at the face. Look at what's behind the eyes. And don't go to Linville Gorge. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 34 years old. I teach high school history in Asheville, and I've spent the last 2 years since my divorce trying very hard not to think about the summer of 2006. What happened last October in Linville Gorge changed all of that. It changed everything. I'm writing this down because I need it out of my head, and because Priya Anand deserves to be remembered correctly. Not as a missing person, not as a statistic in some Burke County report. As a person who laughed too loud at her own jokes and carried a travel-sized French press in her backpack and didn't deserve a single moment of what happened to her in that gorge. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I know how I sounded when I gave my statement to the Rangers. I know the word they used, disoriented. I saw it in the report. I also know what I saw. Those two things don't cancel each other out. It was Danny Cho's idea. Of course it was Danny's idea. Everything stupid and wonderful I've done in my adult life started with Danny saying, "Come on, man, it'll be good for you." We met freshman year at UNC Chapel Hill, lived together for 4 years, and in all that time I never once won an argument with him. He had this way of making the reckless thing sound like the obvious thing. He called me in early September. Priya was coming, he said. She'd never been to the Blue Ridge and she wanted a real backcountry experience, not a day hike from a paved parking lot. He'd been talking to her about Linville Gorge specifically. 4 days, 3 nights, permits already pulled. The wilderness area. The actual gorge, not the touristy overlook trail. I told him no. He said, "Marcus, you grew up 40 minutes from there. You've been scared of that place for 18 years because of something that probably had nothing to do with the place itself." He was referring to my sister Maya. She disappeared at Linville Gorge in the summer of 2006. She was 14 years old. I was 16. We were with our parents at a campsite off Pine Gap Trail, and Maya went to use the bathroom alone at 6 in the morning and never came back. No remains ever found. No explanation ever given. The search lasted 11 days. I've never been back. Danny knew all of this. He also knew, with the particular accuracy of someone who loves you, that I had been using Maya's disappearance as a reason to stop living my life. That the divorce from Claire had something to do with it. That I was 34 years old and spending my weekends alone in my apartment grading papers I didn't care about. So I said yes. Priya Anand was not what I expected. I'd spoken to her twice on the phone before the trip and formed a mental image that was completely wrong. She was compact and direct, with an ER nurse's total lack of patience for ambiguity. She met us in the parking lot of the outfitter in Marion with her gear already perfectly packed. 2 Nalgene's full, poles collapsed and strapped. She looked at my pack and told me I was carrying too much weight. She was right. She had dark eyes and a habit of asking follow-up questions before you'd finished your first sentence. And she made Danny visibly nervous in a way I'd never seen anyone make Danny nervous, which I found deeply entertaining. On the drive from Marion toward the trailhead, she kept the window cracked despite the October cold and held her hand in the wind like a kid. "Tell me about the gorge," she said. "It's called the Grand Canyon of the East," Danny said. "By whom?" "By people who haven't been to the Grand Canyon," I said. She laughed at that. It was a real laugh, loud and unself-conscious. I liked her immediately. What I didn't tell her then, what I kept to myself for the first full day of hiking, was that I recognized almost nothing of the landscape I remembered from childhood. That was the disorienting part. I had spent 18 years constructing a memory of this place, keeping it intact and terrible. And now the gorge itself seemed to have no interest in confirming any of it. The rock faces were familiar in the way that dreams are familiar. The Linville River, visible below us through the hardwoods in pale October light, moved the way I remembered it moving. But the trail felt new under my feet, like a different road to the same terrible destination. We stopped for gas at a small station off NC 181, about 4 miles from the trailhead. Danny filled the tank. Priya was inside buying water and trail mix and making the teenage cashier deeply uncomfortable with her efficiency. I was leaning against the truck when the old man came around the corner of the building. He wasn't alarming at first. Late 60s, maybe 70, heavy canvas jacket. He had the look of someone who had spent most of his life outside. Not lean and athletic, but weathered in the way wood gets when it's left in the rain too long. He stopped when he saw the packs in the bed of the truck. "Gorge?" he said. "Yeah," Danny said. The man looked at the packs for a long moment. Not at us, at the packs specifically, like he was reading something. "How long?" "4 nights, Danny said. The man nodded slowly. "Which trail in?" "Babel Tower to the river," Danny said. "Camp at the river first 2 nights, then up to Sitting Bear and back out via Pinch In." Another long pause. The man turned and looked south, toward the gorge. The October sky was pale and high and entirely cloudless. "You know what the locals call those bottom camps," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Danny said. "The listening places." He said it flatly, without drama. "Because of the echo. Sound comes up out of that gorge in a way that doesn't make sense, like it's traveling in the wrong direction." He paused. "Or like something is sending it." "We'll keep that in mind," Danny said, which was his polite way of ending a conversation. The old man looked at me for the first time. "You've been here before," he said. I didn't answer. "There are things in that gorge that know about return," he said. "They pay particular attention to it." He looked down at his hands, which were scarred across the knuckles in a way that suggested old work, old damage. "If something comes to you down there, something that knows your name or knows a name you've tried to forget, you walk away from it. You don't run. Running draws it. You just walk." Danny said, "Thanks for the advice." He replaced the gas cap. The man went back around the corner of the building. We didn't see him go into the station. We didn't see him go anywhere. When Priya came out with her water and her trail mix, I almost told her what he'd said, and then I didn't. I've thought about that decision every day since. The first night was beautiful in a way that almost undid everything I'd been afraid of. We made camp on a gravel bar beside the Linville River at around 4 in the afternoon, with 2 hours of light left. The gorge walls rose 600 feet on both sides of us, sheer quartzite faces in bands of cream and rust and gray, and the river ran fast and cold over black boulders with a sound like constant applause. The October light came down into the gorge at a steep angle, and the hardwoods were at peak color, red oak and sourwood and hickory all burning at once, and the whole thing looked like the inside of a cathedral that had been set on fire. Priya stood at the river's edge for a long time without saying anything. Danny set up the tents. I gathered wood for a fire. That should have been the first sign, and I didn't recognize it. The wood was dry. I could see it was dry. The gray silver of well-seasoned hardwood, bark loose, no moss. But the fire wouldn't catch. I used 3 matches, then 4. I had a lighter in my side pocket, and that didn't work either. Danny came over and tried, and we spent 20 minutes crouched over a pile of kindling in the early dusk, getting nothing but smoke. And then it caught, and the flame was wrong. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before it shifted to the normal orange-yellow of a campfire. But for those 10 seconds, the flame was distinctly, unambiguously blue. Not the thin blue you sometimes see at the base of a gas burner. A deep, rich blue, almost violet, the color of a gas flame turned all the way up. And cold. I felt cold heat from it, if that makes sense, which it doesn't. But that's the only way I know how to describe it. "Did you see that?" I said. "See what?" Priya said. She was behind me, unrolling her sleeping pad. "The fire was blue," I said. "First few seconds sometimes run blue if there's something on the wood," Danny said. He didn't look up. I didn't push it. The fire was normal. The night was cold and clear, and the river made its constant sound, and we ate freeze-dried food. And Danny told a story about his cousin that was mostly embellished, and Priya corrected him on the medical details, with the precision of someone who finds other people's exaggerations personally offensive. I laughed harder than I had in months. I went to bed first. I zipped my sleeping bag to the chin. I woke at 3 in the morning. My sleeping bag was unzipped to my waist, and the tent door was open. The zipper was on the outside. I sat up and looked at the open door for a long time. Cold air moved through it. Outside, the river. Outside, the gorge walls, dark and enormous. Outside, October. I don't sleepwalk. I've never sleepwalked. I zipped the tent closed, zipped my bag, and told myself I had done it in my sleep without knowing. I told myself that very carefully, the way you tell a child something you're not entirely sure is true. The second day was hard and good. We hiked south along the river bottom, scrambling over boulders and through creek crossings where the water came to our thighs. Priya moved through it without complaint, planting her poles with clinical precision. Danny was ahead of us both, charging up every rise and waiting at the top with an infuriating grin. The GPS began malfunctioning around 11 in the morning. My phone lost signal at the trailhead, which was expected. But I had a dedicated GPS unit, a Garmin InReach that Danny had made me buy specifically for this trip. At 11, the unit began showing our position as approximately 2 miles east of where we actually were, placing us inside the gorge wall itself, in solid rock. When I recalibrated, it placed us a mile north. I turned it off and on 3 times. Each time it showed a different position, none of them correct. "Gorge walls interfere with signal," Danny said. "That's not how GPS works," Priya said. "GPS doesn't care about canyon walls. It's satellite." "Then the unit's defective," and Danny said. I put it away. We were navigating by the river and the topo map anyway. What I noticed, and didn't say, the topo map, which I had printed and laminated before the trip, was correct in every detail I could verify, except that the contour lines in one section, about 2 square inches of the map corresponding to the area we were moving through, were subtly different from what I remembered printing. I had studied this map. The contour lines in that section seemed closer together than before, indicating a steeper grade. But when I looked at the terrain around us, nothing matched that. The terrain was what I remembered from the original map, only the paper had changed. I folded the map and put it in my hip pocket and didn't mention it. We made camp earlier on the second night, on a wide, flat section of the gravel bar. The day had been warmer than expected, and we were damp from the crossings. We laid everything out to dry on the boulders and ate sitting on a log, and the conversation turned to work, and then to Danny's older sister, who had just had a baby, and then to something Priya said about the quality of emergency care in rural mountain counties that led to a long, heated, entirely genuine argument between her and Danny that ended with both of them laughing. I watched them without envy, mostly. There was a small, clean sadness to it that I'd learned to carry without complaint. I went to bed at 9. Danny stayed up by the fire with Priya. At some point I fell asleep. Deeply, completely the way you sleep when you've spent real physical effort in cold, clean air. When I woke, it was still dark. The fire was out. The camp was silent. Danny's tent was empty. I found this out at 5 in the morning when I unzipped my tent to pee and saw the door of his tent standing open. I crossed to it and looked in. His sleeping bag was there, open. His boots were there. He never hikes without his boots. He has strong opinions about boots. His headlamp was there. His phone was in the mesh pocket of the tent. The night was black and cold, and the river was the only sound. I woke Priya. She took in the information with the containment of someone who manages emergencies professionally. She asked me twice whether he might have gone to find a bathroom spot in the dark. I said yes, it was possible. She said we'd give him an hour before doing anything. She started the camp stove and made coffee, and we sat outside the tents in our down layers with our headlamps on, and the gorge walls above us in the darkness were massive and indifferent. And I thought about my sister Maya going to the bathroom alone at 6 in the morning in a campsite not 4 miles from where I was sitting. The hour passed. I was about to suggest going for the emergency satellite communicator when we heard him. He was coming from upstream, from the north. We could hear the crunch of footsteps on gravel before we could see him in the beam of my headlamp. He was walking normally, unhurried. "Danny," Priya said, and there was relief and anger in it in equal measure. He came into the light. He was barefoot. This registered immediately. Wrongly. And his face was relaxed and open in a way that didn't match the situation. He looked at us both and smiled. "Hey," he said. "Where did you go?" Priya said. "For a walk," he said. "You've been gone 4 hours," she said. "It's 5 in the morning, it's 38 degrees, you don't have your boots." He looked down at his feet on the gravel. He didn't look alarmed. He looked interested. "I didn't need them," he said. Something moved through me then, up from somewhere ancient and visceral. Not a thought, an awareness. Something was wrong with the way he was looking at his own feet. "Danny," I said, "what were you doing for 4 hours?" He looked at me. The smile didn't change. I want to describe the smile carefully because it's the part that I keep returning to, the part I go back to in the middle of the night. It wasn't a bad smile. It wasn't sinister or threatening. It was Danny's own smile. The same teeth, the same slight asymmetry where the left side of his mouth lifts a little higher than the right. But it didn't respond to anything. It didn't shift when I said his name. It didn't tighten when Priya said she'd been scared. It stayed exactly where it was, like something positioned rather than felt. "I was listening," he said. "To what?" Priya said. He looked at her with the same steady, unchanging expression. "You'd be amazed, May," he said. "What's been saying your name?" Priya looked at me over his shoulder. I looked back at her. Neither of us said anything. He went into his tent. Within minutes we could hear him breathing evenly. Asleep. Priya and I sat outside until sunrise. Neither of us slept. In the daylight he was almost normal. Almost. He ate breakfast. He talked. He remembered things he should remember. The names of Priya's siblings, a trip we'd taken to the Outer Banks in 2019. The names of my ex-wife's cats. He laughed at the right moments. He kept pace on the trail. But he didn't blink at the right intervals. I started noticing it around 10 in the morning. I'd been watching him the way you watch someone after a head injury, cataloging for things that are absent, and blinks are something you don't track consciously because they're too quick and too constant. But when they're wrong, when they happen at the wrong frequency, your nervous system notices before your brain does. I felt the wrongness in my stomach before I understood what was causing it. He was blinking approximately every 40 to 50 seconds. A normal resting rate is 15 to 20 times per minute. I said nothing. The GPS continued to malfunction. At noon, it showed us as stationary when we were moving. At 2, it showed us as 300 meters underground. At 2:30, Danny stopped on the trail and pointed at a dead tulip poplar about 20 meters off the path. A massive thing that had fallen and been leaning against the gorge wall for what looked like years. "That tree was standing yesterday," he said. I looked at it. It had clearly been dead and leaning for a long time. "Danny," I said carefully, "that tree has been down for years." He stared at it for a long moment. "No," he said pleasantly. "It wasn't." Priya and I exchanged another look. I'd been doing that all day, looking at her for confirmation that I was still reading reality correctly, and she'd been doing the same to me. At camp that evening, while Danny was at the river filtering water, she came and stood next to me at the fire. "Something happened to him last night," she said quietly. "I know. I don't mean he got lost or had a panic attack or hit his head." She paused. "I mean something happened that I don't have a category for. What do you want to do?" She was quiet for a moment. "I want to leave tomorrow. Early. I want to get him out of here." She looked at the river, at Danny crouched over the water with his filter. "I want to take him to a hospital." "He'll refuse," I said. "I know he will," she said. "Help me convince him." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bag and listened. The river was constant. The gorge around it was not. At some point, I can't give a time because my phone had lost all function by then, not just signal, but the clock itself, the screen showing a fixed time of 3:06 regardless of when I checked it. I heard a child crying. It came from upstream, clear and high and unmistakable. A child, maybe 2 years old, the kind of cry that isn't a wail, but a sustained, broken sobbing. The sound of someone who has been crying for a long time. I sat up. There was no child. We were a full day's hike from the nearest trailhead, and this was not a trail that families with toddlers used. The gorge was rated strenuous to dangerous in 3 guidebooks and required a permit. I listened to it for what felt like 2 minutes. It didn't get louder or quieter. It stayed exactly where it was, upstream, in the dark, on the gravel bar or just beyond it. Then it stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. Closer. Between the tents. Breathing. Slow, measured, through the nose. Closer than Danny's tent. The space between his tent and mine was maybe 6 feet. And the breathing was there, in that 6 feet of cold October air, and it was not mine. I stopped breathing myself and listened. 10 seconds. 20. The sound stopped. Gradually, like something moving away. I did not open my tent. I lay with my eyes open in the dark, and I thought about the old man at the gas station who said you walk away from it. You don't run. And I thought about my sister Maya, who was 14 years old and went to use the bathroom alone in the morning and was never found. And I thought about Danny on the gravel bar barefoot at 5 in the morning saying you'd be amazed what's been saying your name. And I thought about the campfire that burned blue. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I woke Priya at first light and told her what I'd heard. She listened to all of it, the child crying, the breathing, without expression. "We're leaving today," she said. "Right now. We're not finishing the loop. We're going back the way we came." I agreed. We woke Danny. He came out of his tent in the morning gray and stood with his arms at his sides and looked at us with that same positioned, unmoving expression. "We're cutting the trip short," Priya said. "Pack your things. We're going out the way we came in." "Why?" he said. "Because I'm saying so," she said. She was controlled, clear, the voice she probably used in the ER when a situation required someone to simply be obeyed. Something moved through his face. Not distress, exactly. Something more like calculation. It lasted less than a second, and then the smile returned. "Okay," he said. "Sure." He packed without complaint. That, too, was wrong. Danny argues about everything. He would have pushed back at minimum for 20 minutes. He packed in silence, efficiently, and stood at the edge of the gravel bar looking north up the gorge, while Priya and I broke down the remaining gear. I watched him from the corner of my eye. He was very still. Birds moved in the canopy above us. The river ran. He stood at the edge of the gravel with his pack on and his poles in his hands and did not move and did not blink. We started north at 7:30. The hike back should have taken 4 hours. We had made it in 4 on the way in. We were moving faster now, pushing. Priya setting the pace in front and Danny behind me and me in the middle. A configuration Priya had arranged without explaining why. I knew why. She wanted Danny where we could both see him. We hiked for 4 hours and did not reach the trailhead. We hiked for 5 hours and the gorge looked the same in every direction. Same river, same rock walls, same October canopy. I pulled out the topo map and tried to orient by the landmarks, the river bends and creek confluences, and nothing was lining up. Either we were in a section of the gorge I didn't recognize, or the map was showing me something that didn't match the terrain. At noon, Priya called a stop. "We should have been out 2 hours ago," she said. She said it flatly, without panic, which was somehow worse than panic. "Terrain's harder going north," Danny said. He was sitting on a boulder eating a granola bar, his expression unchanged. "Takes longer." "We covered this same distance in 4 hours going south," she said. He shrugged. "Okay. Have you been here before?" And she said, "Since last night." "Have you been on this section of trail?" He looked at her. The smile. "I've been here for a while," he said. Priya and I looked at each other. "We need to try the satellite communicator," I said. The communicator was in Danny's pack. We had distributed gear by weight and function, and the emergency communicator was in Danny's pack, because Danny's pack was the heaviest and the communicator was the lightest high-value item. This was a decision I'd been rolling over in my mind all morning. "Danny," I said, "the SAT communicator. I need it." He looked at me for a long moment. "Sure," he said. He unslung his pack and set it on the ground and unzipped the top pocket and handed me the communicator. It was dead. The screen was blank. I pressed the power button and held it. Nothing. "It was fully charged before we left," Priya said. "It must have gotten wet," Danny said. It hadn't. The top pocket of a pack doesn't flood in dry weather. "Okay," Priya said very quietly. "We keep moving north." We hiked for another 2 hours. The light began to change, the gorge going gold and then amber as the sun tracked west, and the creeping certainty that we would not get out before dark was becoming undeniable. I could feel it in my chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with the hiking. Priya was beside me at a rest stop, her voice very low. "If it gets dark," she said, "we make camp. We don't move in this gorge in the dark." Agreed. And tomorrow we keep going north until we hit the trailhead or we hit the highway. We stay on the river. Agreed. She looked at me. "Marcus, has anything like this happened to you before? Here?" She paused. "In 2006, I felt the question physically. My sister disappeared here," I said. "She just wasn't where she was supposed to be. We never found out why. We never found her." Priya was quiet. "The ranger report said the conditions were normal," I said. "No one had any explanation. They looked for 11 days. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I think we should stay very close together tonight." "Yes," I said. "I think so too." What I didn't say, I had been watching Danny for the past 2 hours of hiking and something had changed in the way he moved. Something had changed in the way he moved through terrain specifically. The Danny I knew hiked with a slight forward lean, weight on the balls of his feet, poles clicking in a specific rhythm. He'd hiked this way for 15 years. It was as distinctive to me as his handwriting. The thing walking behind me hiked with its weight centered differently. The poles hit the ground in a different pattern. The footfall was slightly too light for his size. I understood then, fully and without any internal argument, that whatever had come back to camp at 5 in the morning was not Danny Cho. We made camp in a tight bend of the river, where the gorge wall cut the wind. The three of us set up the tents in a triangle, closer together than before. We ate without speaking much. The fire wouldn't light for a long time, longer than the first night, and when it did catch, it did not burn blue. It burned normally. I don't know why that was more frightening. At 8 o'clock, Priya said she was going to sleep. She looked at me as she said it, and the look contained a volume of information. Stay awake, stay aware, do not leave my line of sight if you can help it. I said I'd stay up a while. Danny sat across the fire from me. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He was looking at me with the steady, positioned smile, and I was looking at the fire, and the river moved, and the gorge above us was a slot of dark sky with a handful of stars that were somehow wrong, were in positions that didn't match October, or didn't match this latitude, or didn't match anything I could identify, though I wasn't an astronomer and couldn't have said specifically why they looked wrong, only that they did. "Marcus," he said. His voice was Danny's voice. This was the thing I kept having to remind myself of, because the voice made everything in my chest want to relax into the familiar. The voice was Danny's voice exactly. The cadence, the slight rasp from years of talking too loudly in loud places. "Yeah," I said. "You came back," he said. "To the gorge." "Yes." A pause. "She's still here, you know." My hands were flat on my knees. I kept them flat. "Don't," I said. "She's not in pain," he said. "That's the thing no one tells the families. They're not in pain. They're listening, like I was, like you'd be amazed." The smile adjusted fractionally, widened slightly. "She knows you came back. She's been waiting for you to come back." I stood up. "I'm going to bed," I said. "She wants to see you," he said. "She says your name sounds different from inside the gorge. She says everything sounds different from—" "Stop talking," I said. Something happened to the thing's face then. The smile went. Not into another expression, just gone. The face underneath it was blank, in a way that a human face isn't blank. A human face at rest still moves. There's micro-movement in the muscles around the eyes and mouth, the small constant adjustments of a living system. His face went totally still. For 3 seconds, it was like looking at a photograph of Danny Cho. Then he smiled again and blinked. Once, slowly, and said, "Good night, Marcus," in Danny's voice. I went into my tent and lay in my sleeping bag with a knife from my pack in my right hand. The knife was a 4-inch folder that I used for cutting cord and food prep. I'd never had an occasion to use it for anything else. I held it and listened. For an hour, nothing. River. Wind moving through the gorge. Then Priya screamed. Not a short scream, not a startled sound. A full, sustained, desperate scream that ended in something that wasn't a word, and then stopped. I was out of the tent before I was fully conscious of being awake. My headlamp was in my hand. I hit the button. Danny's tent was open, empty. Priya's tent was collapsed. From outside, pushed down from above, the fabric pressed flat against the ground. I grabbed the tent and pulled it up. She wasn't inside. Her sleeping bag was there. Her poles were there. Her boots, which she had kept inside the tent, she had specifically put her boots inside the tent, were there. Something moved at the river's edge, at the limit of my headlamp. 20 meters. 2 figures. One of them was Priya. She was moving wrong. Too rigid, her arms at her sides in a way that looked managed, controlled from outside rather than inside. She was at the river's edge, and the river was fast and black and January cold. The other figure was behind her. Danny's shape, Danny's height, Danny's jacket. Its hands were on her shoulders. I ran. I don't know what I thought I would do. I ran and I screamed his name, Danny's name, not because I thought he would respond to it, but because I had nothing else. I covered the 20 meters and grabbed for the figure's arm. It turned. What I saw lasted maybe a second in my headlamp. The face was Danny's face structurally. Same bones, same geometry. But the eyes were wrong in a way that I cannot fully describe. Not color, not size. They were oriented wrong. Like they were designed by someone who had studied human eyes without fully understanding what they're for. Like something had heard a description of eyes and done its best. It looked at me with those eyes and it smiled. And then Priya drove a tent stake into the side of its neck. She must have had it in her hand the whole time. Must have grabbed it from inside the collapsed tent in the dark, before whatever was there could stop her. It was 6 inches of coated aluminum, and she drove it into the handle, and the thing, Danny's shape, made a sound that was not a human sound, not a scream or a gasp, a resonance. Something at the bottom of the range of human hearing that you feel in the sternum more than you hear with your ears. It let go of her. She fell forward toward the river, and I caught her and we ran. I don't know if it followed us. I didn't look back. She told me not to run. The old man at the gas station had told me not to run, and we ran anyway. North along the river in the dark with one headlamp between us, scrambling over boulders, plunging through crossings, Priya's bare feet on the rocks and me trying to hold her upright and move at the same time. We ran for a long time. At some point, the gorge walls on the east side pulled back and the terrain opened, and I recognized, with a flood of relief so intense it was almost nauseating, the approach to the Babel Tower trailhead. I recognized the rock formation. I'd stared at it from the trailhead on the way in. The trail up was steep. We climbed it on hands and knees in places, Priya's feet bleeding where the gravel had opened the skin. At the top, the trailhead parking lot was empty, and the sky was full of stars, and the night was cold, and the gorge was below us, and silent. We sat on the tailgate of Danny's truck, which had his keys in it because it was his truck, and I started the engine for the heat, and we sat in the heat and didn't speak for a very long time. The search found Danny Cho's body 3 days later, 2 miles downstream from our second campsite. The official cause of death was drowning, consistent with an accidental fall into the Linville River. There was evidence of a blow to the right side of the skull, which the medical examiner attributed to impact with river rocks during submersion. There was no evidence of foul play. The rangers interviewed us both. Priya's account and mine matched in every verifiable detail and diverged catastrophically on every unverifiable one, which is to say the ones that mattered. We both said Danny had been behaving abnormally beginning on the morning of day 3. We both said we had been unable to locate the trailhead and had camped a third night. We diverged on what happened at the river's edge. Priya's official statement said she had been sleepwalking. She had a history of mild somnambulism, and woke to find herself at the river's edge in the dark, disoriented and frightened, and that Marcus had reached her and she had panicked and struck him with an object she'd picked up reflexively. She said Danny must have gone to the river alone. I don't know why she said that. I have tried to reach her 6 times since October. She has not returned my calls. Her account is in the official report. Mine, the version where I describe the thing's face, the wrong eyes, is in a separate document labeled Secondary Interview, Inconsistencies Noted. I teach a unit on the history of folklore every spring. Wendigos, skinwalkers, the Cherokee Uktena. I've taught it for 5 years. The rational history of what fear does to human perception when human perception operates in the dark, under stress, in the wilderness, stripped of its usual reference points. I know what the psychological literature says. I know what sleep deprivation does. I know what grief does. And I had been carrying grief for 18 years before I went back into that gorge. Here is what I also know. I know that Danny Cho's body was found 2 miles downstream, which means he was in the river before Priya and I ran. Before the figure at the river's edge. Before. I know that I have 2 photographs on my phone from the trip, taken on day 2, before the phone lost function. The first photograph is of Priya and Danny at a river crossing. In the background, at the left edge of the frame, half behind a tree, there is a figure. It is standing very still. It is approximately Danny's height and build. It is looking at the camera. Danny is in the foreground, mid-river, looking at Priya. The figure in the background is looking at the camera, at me. The second photograph is from later that same day. It is a photograph of Danny sitting on a boulder eating lunch. In this photograph, he is alone. Except, in this photograph, his shadow is wrong. It falls at an angle inconsistent with the sun position. It falls slightly too long, reaching further than it should. And at the end of his shadow, at the limit of it where a shadow just becomes ground, there are two additional shadows, small and unclear, like the shadows of hands reaching toward him from a direction where nothing stands. I have shown this photograph to no one. There is one more thing. Last week I was teaching my folklore unit. I was talking about the Cherokee tradition, specifically the concept of the Uktana, the great horned serpent said to inhabit the deep water gaps of the southern Appalachians. I was using Linville Gorge as a geographical example because it is one of the deepest water gaps in the region and has associated folklore going back centuries. I was explaining that indigenous communities had specific prohibitions about certain river gorges, about places where the stone goes deep and the water runs fast and the sound echoes in ways that don't correspond to the terrain. A student in the third row raised her hand. She said, "My grandmother is from McDowell County. She says Linville Gorge is where the Echo people live. She says they copy what they hear until they can copy what they see." I stopped. I asked her, "What do they do? The Echo people, when they can copy what they see?" She said her grandmother told her they walked out of the gorge. They walked out, and they went where the person they were copying came from, and eventually, maybe right away, maybe after a long time, no one could tell the difference. The classroom was quiet, 22 juniors looking at me. I said, "Thank you for sharing that." I finished the lecture. I drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. When I did go in, I walked to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. This has become a habit since October. I stand in front of the mirror and I check things. I check the interval between blinks. I check the shadow on the wall behind me, whether it falls at the correct angle, whether it has the correct length. Tonight the blinks were right. The shadow was right. I stood there for a long time checking. But here is the thing about mirrors. Here is the thing I cannot stop coming back to. The thing that sits at the center of everything and will not move. If the thing in the gorge was good enough, if it had been listening long enough, watching long enough, it would know what I check in the mirror. It would have learned to pass. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I don't know what I was looking for. I don't know what I found. Marcus Webb is a high school history teacher in Asheville, North Carolina. He holds a master's degree in Appalachian Studies from UNC Asheville. He has not returned to Linville Gorge. His sister Maya Webb has been listed as missing since July 2006. The case remains open. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 34 years old and I used to sleep fine. I want to state that clearly because everything I'm about to tell you is going to make me sound like someone who doesn't. Someone fragile. Someone whose account of events can't be trusted. I was not that person. I wasn't anyway. Linville Gorge. If you know Western North Carolina, you know it. They call it the Grand Canyon of the East, which is the kind of marketing language that doesn't do the place justice in either direction. It's not as dramatic as the Grand Canyon, but it is older, darker. The gorge cuts roughly 12 miles along the Linville River through Burke County, carved between Jonas Ridge to the east and Linville Mountain to the west, and the walls drop 400 feet in places without apology. The trails inside are unsigned in the backcountry sections. There are no ranger stations within the gorge itself. Cell service ends before you reach the trailhead parking area on Kistler Memorial Highway, not gradually, but all at once, like a door closing. Local outfitters warn you about this. The Wilderness Area brochure mentions it in a parenthetical. Nobody seems to treat it as the warning it is. We went in on the last weekend of September, which was the first real mistake, not because late September is a bad time to hike the gorge, but because the reduced daylight means you get less margin, and margin was what we needed most and understood the value of least. There were 4 of us. Me, Delia Orozco, Patrick Holt, and Joel Briggs. I need you to understand who these people were, because the horror of what happened is inseparable from the fact that I knew them the way you know the inside of your own house. They weren't strangers. Joel and I had been friends since our sophomore year at App State, 15 years, which is long enough that you stop tracking the friendship as a thing and start experiencing it as a fact of the world, the way you experience gravity or the color of your walls. He was a landscape photographer now based in Denver, always somewhere magnificent and always willing to interrupt your phone call with the view out his current window. Delia Orozco I'd met at a regional magazine where we'd both worked for 3 years before I went freelance. She was a nurse practitioner now, driven and observant, the kind of person who gives you a direct answer when you ask for one, even when the direct answer isn't what you wanted. Patrick Holt was Delia's boyfriend of 2 years, a large, quiet man who programmed software during the week and trail ran on weekends, the kind of person who doesn't need to prove anything because he already knows exactly what he's capable of. He had a calm about him I'd always found reassuring. They were good people. The kind of people who notice when you're struggling without turning the noticing into an event. I had been struggling. My marriage to Nina had ended in January after 2 years of trying to save something that had stopped being savable. The divorce was civil and organized and terrible in the specific way that civil and organized terrible things are, because the absence of conflict removes any target for your grief. I'd spent most of the year either working 17-hour days or lying on my couch watching things on my laptop until I fell asleep, neither of which was particularly useful. The camping trip was Delia's idea, and I recognized it as an act of care even as she pitched it as pure adventure. Linville Gorge, she said on the phone in August, her voice warm and matter-of-fact. 3 nights. No service, no email, no lawyers, no Netflix, nothing. Just rock and water and you. Joel booked his flights from Denver before I'd technically agreed to go. We drove up from Charlotte on a Thursday morning in Patrick's truck, 4-door, good suspension, crammed with gear, with Joel in the back seat wedged between his camera pack and a dry bag, telling us about a slot canyon he'd photographed in southern Utah, where the light, at exactly 3 in the afternoon in early November, fell at an angle that turned the sandstone walls to something that looked like the inside of a lit lantern. He had photographs to prove it. He passed his phone up to the front seat, and I looked at the images and felt, for a moment, the uncomplicated pleasure of beauty. It was a good morning. Coffee from a truck stop outside Morganton. Rain threatening in the gray sky over the mountains without delivering. Normal. The trailhead on Kistler Memorial Highway had 2 other vehicles when we pulled in around noon, both empty, both dusty. We suited up in air that was 50 degrees and smelled like the particular layering of pine resin, soil damp with recent rain, and the mineral cold that comes off metamorphic rock when it's been in shadow all day. I remember the weight of my pack settling onto my shoulders and feeling, genuinely and without complicated emotion, better. Like the weight was redistributing something I'd been carrying wrong. The trail dropped into the gorge almost immediately. Steeply, on switchbacks, through hemlock and rhododendron stands so dense they formed walls on both sides. Within 20 minutes of leaving the parking area, the sky above us had been replaced by canopy, and the sound of the highway had been replaced by the sound of the Linville River below, not the pleasant burbling sound of water that appears in meditation applications, but a real river sound, white noise with violence underneath, water moving fast over rock and not particularly caring about anything in its path. I need to describe the gorge itself because the gorge is not incidental. The gorge is where this happened, and the gorge has a quality that most wild places don't. The forest inside is old growth in the undisturbed sections, hemlocks and white oaks that have been standing for 3 and 4 centuries, root systems so massive they've physically rewritten the topography around them, routing water, breaking stone. The canopy closes overhead so completely that even midday feels like late afternoon. The walls are always present, not visible through the trees usually, but felt, a vertical presence at the edge of perception, 400 feet of Precambrian metamorphic rock that has been there for roughly 1 billion years and will be there long after every human concern has resolved itself one way or another. Being in the gorge doesn't make you feel ancient. It makes you feel very new, very temporary. We found a campsite on a flat shelf above the river at around 3 in the afternoon, far enough from the water that conversation didn't require raised voices. The site had been used before. A fire ring of river stones, some cleared ground, a bear hang point on a hemlock limb. Joel declared it perfect and immediately began photographing the late afternoon light on the stone wall across the river. Patrick assessed the fire ring and approved it. Delia and I set up the 2 tents. 2 two-person tents, Joel and me in one, Delia and Patrick in the other, while Patrick filtered water and collected firewood. That first night was unremarkable except for one thing, which I cataloged and filed away as nothing. We had a good fire going by 6. Delia had brought a flask of bourbon, quality bourbon, and we passed it around while Patrick and Joel argued about trail shoes. A conversation I had no investment in, but enjoyed the shape of, the comfortable friction of 2 intelligent people who enjoy disagreeing. The gorge walls were dark beyond the fire's reach, and the river was constant below us. I was doing the thing I do when I'm finally comfortable somewhere, which is to mostly listen and occasionally say something and to feel the loosening of tension that the combination of physical fatigue and good company produces. Nina had hated camping. That thought arrived uninvited and I let it pass. I noticed the fire at around 9. It had been burning orange-yellow all evening, normal fire behavior, and then for approximately 30 seconds, the base of it, the lowest part, where the wood met the accumulated coals, might shifted to a blue-green. Not the whole fire, just the core, like something in the combustion had changed. "Is that?" I pointed. Joel looked. "What?" By then, it had gone back to normal. "The fire was blue," I said, "at the base." "Mineral in the wood," Patrick said without looking up from his mug. "Copper salts. It happens with damp wood sometimes. Some other trace minerals." Delia looked at me with a small smile. She had the nurse's smile, warm but calibrated, designed to reassure without dismissing. "You okay, Marcus?" "I'm good," I said. "Sorry. Nothing. We went to bed around 10. I slept adequately, which was the most I'd been asking of sleep for 8 months. Joel snored beside me, a reliable human sound, and I found it comforting rather than annoying. The river below, the cold air on my face above the bag. I don't remember dreaming. The second day was when things started. We planned a longer hike, north through the gorge toward Sitting Bear Rock and back, maybe 8 miles round trip. Patrick had a paper topographic map and a GPS unit, one of the dedicated outdoor devices with proper topographic mapping loaded. He'd used it on half a dozen backcountry trips in Colorado and Wyoming. Reliable equipment. We were 50 minutes into the trail when Patrick stopped. "Huh," he said. "What?" Delia asked. He held up the GPS. The unit was powered on. The screen was lit. The satellite indicator showed 4 acquired, but the map display was a uniform gray. No topography, no trail markers, no contour lines, just gray, with the position cursor blinking in the middle of nothing. "Signal's fine," Patrick said. "4 sats. The map file is just..." He pressed buttons. The gray persisted. "Corrupted. It has to have corrupted." "Since this morning?" I asked. "I checked it in camp this morning and it was fine." He studied the device another moment, then put it away with the particular economy of motion of a person choosing not to catastrophize. "Paper map works. Let's just navigate old school." We did. Patrick was competent with the topo, and we made good time through the morning, the trail climbing and dropping along the gorge wall above the river. The forest was beautiful and strange, and Joel photographed constantly the root systems of old hemlocks that looked like wooden tentacles, the way the gorge wall reflected in still pools at the river's edge, the long shafts of midday light that made it down through the canopy in certain clearings. Around noon, we stopped on a rock outcrop above the river, a natural observation point where the gorge opened up enough to see the full cross-section. Stone walls on both sides, the river below a silver band, the canopy making a ceiling between the rock faces. I took photographs on my phone. The view was genuinely extraordinary. Looking at the photographs later, just checking framing, standard reflex, I noticed something in one of them. On the far rim of the gorge, on the ridgeline visible above the opposite wall, there was a figure, or something that resolved into the impression of a figure. Tall, very still, pale where everything else was dark green and gray. I enlarged it to maximum zoom. At maximum zoom it was pixels, undifferentiated, the kind of ambiguity that a human brain, hardwired for face and form recognition, assembles into shapes that aren't there. I put my phone away, did not mention it to anyone. 2 hours later, on the return leg, we went north of the trail to look at a section of gorge wall that Joel had spotted, a geological folding in the rock that had created a series of natural shelves and overhangs he wanted to photograph. We were maybe 30 yards off the main trail when Joel grabbed a hemlock trunk for balance and made a short, sharp sound. Involuntary. Cut off almost immediately, the noise you make when the burn is fast. We found him holding his forearm. Blood had already come through his sleeve. What happened? Delia was at his arm before I'd processed what I was seeing. Something bit me. Or, I don't know, I grabbed the tree and something just... He made a stabbing gesture toward his forearm. It went in. A branch? Branches don't do that. Delia pushed up his sleeve and examined the wound. 3 punctures in a rough triangle, widely spaced, wider than any common animal's bite radius. Clean, circular, deep. No jagged edges of tooth marks. No scoring that suggested a claw. The skin around the punctures was already discoloring toward a mottled purple-green, the color spreading outward in irregular patches. Snake? Patrick offered. Not a snakebite pattern. Wrong spacing, and the punctures are too symmetrical. Delia's voice was level and professional. She cleaned the wound with a saline wipe from her first aid kit and wrapped it with practiced efficiency. Numb? Nauseous? Any tingling in the arm or hand? No, it hurts, but just the regular way. She watched him carefully for the next 20 minutes as we walked back to camp. He held color. He maintained pace. He kept up a running commentary about the light conditions in the gorge at 4 in the afternoon. By the time we reached camp and started dinner, I had mostly filed it in the category of weird things that happen in backcountry, and turned out to be nothing. Delia caught my eye once across the fire. She held my gaze for just a moment and then looked away. That night I found the carving. I'd gone to collect more firewood from the tree line, working my headlamp along the edge of our shelf, when the light caught a birch tree that had been worked recently. The carving was deep, 4 to 5 inches of cut into pale wood, the inner bark still wet-looking and fresh. No weathering, no insect activity, no gray oxidation. Done within the last day or 2. 3 words in rough block letters. It hers you. I stood with my headlamp on those words for a long time. The river below. The dark above and around. I thought about calling for the others and decided not to. I told myself it was a prank. Something teenagers did. Something local kids who knew the gorge did to mess with backpackers. Nothing more. I had enough going on. I didn't want to be the person who'd ruined the trip with the blue fire and now with a carved tree. I went back to camp with the firewood. The second night, I slept badly. I lay in my bag and listened to Joel breathe at a slow, even rate, and at some point in the deep part of the night, I guess 2 or 3 in the morning based on the temperature drop, I heard something that pulled me fully awake. A sound that was localized but also wasn't, that seemed to have a source and then to have no source at all. A low, rhythmic concentration of sound at the edge of language. Not quite whispering. Not quite anything I could name. It continued for what I estimated as 15 minutes and then stopped cleanly, without fading, the way sounds fade when they move away. It stopped the way someone stops when they decide to. I lay still after that, listening to Joel's breathing. Regular, slow. The walls of the tent were pale blue-gray with pre-dawn light when I finally gave up on sleep. I unzipped my bag. Joel's bag was open, fully unzipped. The bag flat and empty, peeled back from end to end. He wasn't in the tent. I unzipped the fly and looked out. Cold morning, maybe 5:30. Mist rising off the river. Joel was sitting on a rock at the outermost edge of our shelf, his back to me, looking down into the gorge. Completely still. Not fidgeting, not shifting. Statue still. Joel. Nothing. Joel, hey. He turned slowly and looked at me, and I told myself what I saw was a man who'd woken up early and gone out to watch the sunrise and was sleepy and cold. His expression was calm, neutral, nothing wrong. Couldn't sleep, he said. You scared me. I woke up and you were just gone. Sorry. He turned back to the gorge. It's beautiful, isn't it, in the dark? The mist had reduced the gorge below us to a column of gray nothing. There was nothing beautiful to see. I said so. I can see it, he said very simply and went back to looking. I returned to the tent and lay awake until the light was fully up, telling myself it was nothing. The third day. I want to be careful here because this is the part I've replayed more than anything else, looking for the moments where I saw what was coming and chose to interpret it as something else. There were a lot of those moments. At breakfast, Joel was almost indistinguishable from Joel. He ate his oatmeal. He complained about the instant coffee. He told us about a canyon photography series he was trying to develop for a pitch to a nature magazine, and asked Patrick and me for feedback on the concept, which was genuinely good and which we gave genuine feedback on. He was present and coherent in himself, except he didn't blink normally. I noticed this mid-conversation and then kept noticing it. The way once you hear a sound you can't unhear it. The average person blinks 12 to 15 times per minute. Joel was blinking maybe 3 or 4 times in the minutes I watched him, and each blink was slow, considered slightly too deliberate. And when something amusing was said, when Patrick made a dry joke about ultralight backpacking culture, Joel's smile arrived a fraction of a second after the laughter, just slightly asynchronous, like a video file where the audio and the picture are marginally out of sync. I filed these things, I moved on. We were making breakfast in a gorge with no cell service, and I had decided to be fine. We planned a shorter day, a few miles of hiking, some photography, camp maintenance in the afternoon. Patrick wanted to reseal a leaking tent seam. Delia and I said we'd walk the river while the guys were in camp. Before we left, I told her about the carving. She was quiet for a moment. The river was loud between us and whatever came next. It hers you, she repeated, exactly as if she were reading it. I figured it was kids messing around, but the wood was fresh. When I was little, my grandmother told stories about things that live in places like this. Mountain places. Gorges, deep caves, spots where water runs through old rock. She paused. She called them listeners. She said they were drawn to need, to longing, grief. She glanced at me sideways. She was from Guerrero. It was a different tradition, different words, but the idea was the same. Something in the deep places that hears you before you know you're speaking. Delia? I know. It's a folk story. She gave a short laugh. I'm a nurse practitioner. I don't believe in listeners. She paused. I also want to tell you that when I woke up at about 3 this morning, I heard Joel outside our tent, standing against the fly. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he was checking the weather. I stared at her. There was no weather to check. The sky was clear. I know. She looked at the gorge wall. And I want to check his wound this morning. The discoloration was spreading when I changed the dressing last night. We walked the river for 2 hours. Nothing happened. The gorge was the gorge, old and cold and indifferent, the kind of beautiful that doesn't care whether you're there to see it. We watched a great blue heron on a mid-river boulder for 15 minutes. The bird absolutely motionless, patient in a way that felt geological rather than animal. I took photographs, normal ones. When we returned to camp, Patrick was there. Joel was not. Patrick was sitting outside the tent with the seam sealer in his hand, not applying it to anything, just sitting. He looked up when we came into the site. His expression was something I'd never seen on Patrick's face before. Not distress exactly, but the visible effort of a controlled, self-sufficient man working to stay controlled. "Where's Joel?" I asked. He said he was taking a walk. About an hour ago. He pointed north, the untrailed section, the section the topo map labeled with no features. "Which direction exactly?" "Into there." He put the seam sealer down carefully. He didn't bring his water bottle. I looked at the tent. Joel's water bottle was inside the tent door where he'd left it that morning. His pack was there. His camera. "He left without any gear?" Delia said. "I told him to take his water." Patrick was quiet for a moment. He looked at me like he didn't know what water was for. We waited 90 minutes before Delia and I agreed to go look. I asked Patrick to stay at camp. He agreed without arguing, which was not like Patrick, who argued about things as a mode of engagement rather than from actual resistance. He just nodded. As Delia and I headed north into the untrailed section, I turned back once. Patrick was sitting where we'd left him in front of the tent, looking down at his hands. Not at the gorge. Not at the sky. At his own hands, with an expression I couldn't name. We found Joel 40 minutes north of camp. He was standing at the base of a section of gorge wall, in a place where the cliff face rose sheer above him for 300 feet. Precambrian stone in gray and dark green layers that had been accumulating since before the first animal existed with eyes to see them. He had his palms flat against the rock and his face very close to the stone, not looking at it, listening to it. "Joel," I said. He didn't turn. His shoulders moved slightly, a fine adjustment of pressure against the wall. "Joel." He turned then. And I remember the specific timing of what I saw next. First, the smile, which arrived on his face before he'd completed the turn, before he could have fully seen us, as though it had been there already and just needed to be pointed in our direction. Wide. Symmetric. Still. His eyes were very wide and almost entirely without blinks. The wound on his forearm had darkened to a deep purple-black at the puncture sites, and the skin surrounding each puncture was drawing inward, concave, as though the tissue was contracting toward those 3 points, as though something was pulling it inward from the inside. "Hey," he said, warmly, normally. "What are you doing?" Delia's voice was clinical and controlled. "Listening." He patted the stone with one hand. "Have you ever actually listened to a mountain? Not to wind in the trees or water over rock, to the actual stone." He turned his head and pressed his ear to the wall. "It has so much to say." "Joel, come back to camp with us." I kept my voice level. "Of course," he said agreeably, and stepped away from the wall as if he'd simply been admiring the view. He walked between us the whole way back to camp. He talked the entire way. The photography pitch, my divorce, a documentary he'd seen about cave systems in Vietnam, the altitude variation in the gorge, and the words were right. The sentences were grammatically coherent, the content tracked. But something in the pacing was wrong. The answers came a beat after the questions, a consistent lag, as though the words were being retrieved rather than produced, as though something was selecting them from a list. He did not blink once in 40 minutes. Back at camp, Patrick was still sitting where we'd left him. He looked up and said, "Good, you found him," in a voice completely stripped of intonation. Not monotone. More like a voice from which the register of emotion had been removed, leaving the sounds of language without the music of it. We ate dinner earlier than planned. Delia ran the conversation with the skill I'd always admired in her, the ability to maintain warmth and normalcy as a structural project rather than an ambient feeling, asking Joel about his work and his friends, and an artist he'd mentioned following on Instagram. Joel answered everything. He ate his portion of the freeze-dried meal. He held his fork the right way, but during a natural pause in conversation, nothing dramatic, just a breath between topics, Joel looked at each of us in turn. One by one, slowly, with those wide, unblinking eyes. Not aggressively, not with any visible emotion, just looking, with an attentiveness that felt less like curiosity and more like inventory. Patrick, Delia, me, each held for a moment, Then back to his food, Patrick said quietly, looking at his own hands. "Can I see your arm, Joel?" Joel looked at his forearm, then at Patrick. He held out the arm. Delia unwrapped it. The punctures had not closed the way wounds close. The skin around them had continued pulling inward, the depressions now visibly deep. The tissue gone from purple-black at the sites to something that had no color I had a word for. A color that was wrong in the specific way of things that have stopped being alive. And at the outer edges of the discoloration, barely visible in the firelight, the skin had begun to take on a fine patterning. Not scales, not quite, but a faint geometric regularity, as though something was organizing itself just beneath the surface. "Does it hurt?" Delia asked. Joel looked at the arm with the same calm he looked at everything. "Not anymore," he said. He smiled. That night I lay in my sleeping bag and did not sleep. I had made a decision. We were leaving at dawn. We were walking out of this gorge as fast as we could move, and we were putting Joel in a vehicle and driving to Mission Hospital in Asheville and letting people with better equipment and more knowledge than me figure out what was happening to my friend. I repeated this plan in my head like a mantra because the alternative, lying there trying to understand what was happening, was not something I could afford to do. The sound started again around 2 a.m, louder than the previous nights. It had no directionality tonight, no single source. It came equally from the gorge walls and the river and the canopy above. A low, rhythmic concentration of sound that was almost language and was not language, that moved through a register that you felt as much as heard. The tent walls did not move. The fire outside had gone to coals. Joel was on his back beside me, eyes open, staring at the tent ceiling. "Joel," I whispered. "Go to sleep, Marcus," he said. "Everything is fine." In the dark, his eyes caught the faint residual light from the coals outside and reflected it back, like an animal's eyes, like tapetum, that reflective layer behind the retina that cats and deer have, that allows them to see in the dark. Human eyes do not have tapetum. I did not sleep. I lay still with my eyes closed and measured time by the change in cold, the progressive deepening of it toward 4 a.m, and then the slightly less absolute cold of pre-dawn, and then the tent walls went gray, and I got up. Patrick was already outside, crouched by the dead fire, trying to coax it back to life. He looked up when I came out. "Where's Delia?" I asked. He stood up slowly. "She went to the bathroom, maybe 20 minutes ago." He pointed toward the latrine area we'd established 20 yards from camp. "She left a note." He showed me the paper, Delia's handwriting, her precise blocky nurse's script. "Bathroom, back in 5. I called her name. The gorge broke it up and returned the pieces separately, her name coming back in syllables that didn't belong to each other. Patrick and I searched the latrine area, the tree line on both sides, the approach to the trail. I called her name until my voice hurt. Joel came out of the tent and stood in the middle of the campsite watching us, arms at his sides, with a patience that had no urgency in it. "Where is she?" I asked him. "I don't know," he said, and smiled. And that was the moment I understood, not intellectually, not in a way I could have articulated, but in the body, the ancient part of the body that is older than language, that the thing looking at me from behind Joel's eyes was not Joel. It was wearing his face correctly. It had all his words. But it was wearing him the way you wear a coat, and something in its posture, something in the uncanny stillness of it, the absence of the micro-movements that living things make without thinking, communicated what it was as clearly as a sign. I looked at Patrick and he looked at me. We packed without speaking. Fast. Essentials. Weight distributed for speed. Nothing unnecessary. The PLB emergency beacon went into my hip belt pocket where I could reach it. Joel watched us pack and then, without being asked, went into the tent and began assembling his own gear with methodical calm. "He stays in front of me," Patrick said very low. "We can't. Joel might still." "He stays in front of me," Patrick repeated, "or we go without him." I thought about my friend of 15 years and the smile that didn't belong to him, and the cold of his skin when he'd put his hand over mine. "Okay," I said. He walks ahead. "I told Joel we were heading out," he said, "ready when you are," and stepped onto the trail heading south toward the trailhead. For a moment this seemed like a good sign, a cooperative sign, and I let it be a good sign because I needed one. We were 40 minutes into the hike when I noticed the forest. No birds, not just quiet, absent. The gorge had its usual sounds, water, wind, the creak of stressed wood. But no birds, no squirrels, no movement in the undergrowth. The forest on both sides of the trail was empty of everything that had been living in it. I stopped and looked at Joel ahead of me. He had stopped too on the trail and his head was tilted again, too far, too slow, looking back at me. "You doing okay?" I said. "Perfect," he said. Around a bend in the trail, Patrick's voice, "Delia." I moved forward fast. Patrick had stopped 20 yards ahead of us and Delia was standing in the middle of the trail 15 yards beyond him, facing us. She was unhurt. She was standing. She was smiling. It was the wrong smile. I knew it at the same moment I registered that it was her face. The wrong smile on the right face. The worst thing. Not the smile of someone who's been found. No relief. No breathlessness. A smile that was waiting for something. Patrick walked toward her, saying her name. I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said. He pulled away from me. He reached her, put his hands on her shoulders. She looked at him with her head at the exact angle Joel's had tilted when he looked at me. The exact angle. As though whatever had learned to operate Joel had taught the same posture to whatever was operating Delia. "I want to show you something," she said. Her hand came up and took Patrick's wrist and she turned, leading his gaze off the trail into the trees, toward the gorge wall. "Delia, we need to go. Come look," she said, and walked into the trees with his wrist in her hand. Something hit me from behind. I went down full length on the trail and got a face full of dirt, my hands skidding out in front of me, and Joel's weight landed on my back. His weight, distributed wrong, too heavy in the wrong places, like something had rearranged the contents of him. I threw myself sideways and rolled off the trail edge, and went sliding down the embankment on dead leaves and wet roots. I caught a root with both hands and stopped myself, suspended on the slope, maybe 8 feet below the trail. Above me, Joel stood at the edge looking down. His face was in shadow. His eyes caught the light the way they had in the tent. From the trees where Delia had led Patrick, a sound. Patrick's voice, beginning a word that did not finish. A sound beneath that word that had no human analogy. Then nothing. Joel stepped off the trail toward me and I let go of the root. I went down through the brush in a controlled fall that was mostly falling, crashing through rhododendron and mountain laurel, the branches catching at my jacket and face. Going down on my knees twice and getting up both times without slowing because behind me there was movement and the sound, the low rhythmic sound, was everywhere now, in all directions, in the walls, and the water, and the air. I hit the river running and went into my knees and nearly went over completely on the mossy rocks and caught a boulder, and held it. The water was 40 degrees. It was all at once and total, and it stopped everything except the fact of the moment, which is the only useful thing extreme cold does. I looked at the opposite gorge wall, sheer, no root. I looked downstream. The Linville River ran south toward Linville Falls, toward the National Forest boundary, toward roads. Maybe 3 miles, maybe more. I reached into my hip belt pocket and activated the PLB. I moved downstream in the river because the riverbanks were impenetrable. Rhododendron so dense it formed a solid wall from the water's edge to the gorge walls. The water ran waist-deep in the channels between boulders and knee-deep in the shallows, and at no point did it let me forget what it was. I moved for what I calculated as 90 minutes to 2 hours. Not running. You can't run in a river over boulders. But moving with everything I had, not stopping. Not looking back after the first quarter mile because every time I looked back I saw shapes in the trees above the riverbanks that moved when I moved, and went still when I went still, and I could not afford to look at them. The sound of Linville Falls reached me first as a change in the river's voice. deeper, more insistent. And then, as a physical vibration underfoot. Beyond it, faintly, traffic. Highway sound. A truck. I got out of the river on the eastern bank and climbed through hemlock and boulder to the maintained trail above the falls. And on that trail I found a retired man walking a golden retriever, both of them alive and solid and real in the manner of ordinary things, and he looked at me, soaked to the chest, face cut from the rhododendron, shaking steadily, and said without drama, "What happened to you?" I said I needed to use his phone. He gave it to me. Search and rescue was in the gorge by that afternoon. They found Patrick's body 4 miles north of the falls, on the gorge floor below the trail. The medical examiner's report uses language I won't repeat here. What I'll say is that he did not suffer the way you'd suffer from a fall, and that the wounds were inconsistent with the fall that the official finding determined caused his death. They did not find Delia. They searched for 4 days with trained teams and dogs. The dogs, the handlers reported, would not enter certain sections of the gorge. They became agitated at the boundaries of those sections and refused to proceed regardless of what the handlers tried. The handlers noted this in the incident report with the clipped language that people who work outside use to describe things they don't want to describe. Team dogs refused approach. Unusual behavior. Alternative route taken. They found Joel. He was sitting on a river boulder 2 miles north of where I'd last seen him, hands folded in his lap, looking at the water. No gear, no pack. His feet were bare. The wound on his forearm was closed, more than closed. The skin had re-knit in a way that the attending paramedic described as unusual. The punctures sealed and the flesh smooth. No scarring, no discoloration, as though the wound had never occurred, as though the bite had been absorbed. He was transported to Mission Hospital in Asheville by helicopter. He has been there since. The diagnoses have cycled through several categories: dissociative disorder, catatonic schizophrenia, acute trauma response, none of which fully account for what the doctors are observing, which is a person who responds to his name, who eats, who breathes, who produces facial expressions including that wide, fixed, motionless smile, but who has not spoken a word or acknowledged another person's presence since he was found on that boulder. He sits in his room, and sometimes he faces the window, and sometimes he doesn't. The staff find him pleasant, cooperative, easy. The attending paramedic who transported him noted one thing in his incident report. He noted that when the helicopter lifted from the gorge, Joel had looked out the window at the forest below, and that he had smiled at something in the gorge that the paramedic could not identify and could not stop thinking about. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm telling this to the person who asked me directly, because they've read the incident reports and the search and rescue documentation and the autopsy, and they want to know what I believe happened in Linville Gorge in late September. I don't know what happened. I know what the gorge is. 12 miles of old, dark wilderness on rock that has been there for nearly 1 billion years. I know that places of that age exert a quality on the people inside them that is not metaphorical. I know that the forest inside Linville Gorge has never been fully mapped, and that the backcountry sections see maybe a few hundred visitors per year, and that people go missing in wilderness areas in North Carolina at a rate that the National Park Service tracks and does not widely advertise. I've been reading since I got out. The Cherokee were in this region for centuries before European contact. Certain high-elevation gorges and deep river corridors were not used. Not for hunting, not for habitation, not for transit. And when the 19th century ethnographers asked why, they were given answers that didn't translate well into English, and that those ethnographers tended to dismiss as superstition. But one recurring concept survives in the scholarship, in the careful footnotes of James Mooney's late 1800s fieldwork on Cherokee tradition, the idea of certain places as listeners. Not haunted, not cursed, not host to a creature or a spirit in the Western sense. Something more fundamental. A place that hears what you carry inside you, that responds to it, that takes from you what resonates with it, and keeps what it takes. I had told Delia about my grief, and she had told me what her grandmother called the things in deep places. I had walked into the gorge carrying everything I'd been carrying for 8 months. The loss, the longing, the hollow sense of a life that had been full and then wasn't. The carving on the birch tree had said it hears you, and the person who'd carved it had been right and they were gone too, whoever they were. I found the photograph from the rock outcrop on day 2 last month, on an old backup drive. The one with the figure on the far rim. I looked at it again. I enlarged it as far as the file would allow. At maximum zoom, it is still just pixels. The gorge doesn't give you anything clear. It never did. Only accumulation. Only weight. Only Patrick, who is not here. Only Delia, whose name appears at the bottom of every search and rescue report as not found, and who I think about every morning with the specific quality of thought that has no resolution, because there is no resolution, no body, no confirmation, no ending that ends. Only Joel, sitting in a room in Asheville with his hands in his lap, smiling at something that none of us can see. I sleep with the lights on now. I'm telling you that not as a figure of speech but as literal fact, because I need you to understand. I am not a person who imagines things. I am a person who went into a gorge with 3 friends and came out alone and wet and holding a button I'd pressed to call for help that arrived too late for everyone who mattered. The gorge doesn't let go of what it takes. I understand that now. What I keep coming back to, the thing that sits behind everything else, that I can't set down, is not what I saw. Not the smile, not the eyes, not the sound. It's that the carving on the birch tree was fresh, 2 days old, maybe less. Someone else had been in that gorge just before us. Someone else had understood enough to leave a warning. And they were gone. And I had stood in front of that warning with my headlamp and read it and gone back to camp with the firewood. And by the time I was standing at the river with my knees going numb in 40-degree water and my hand shaking on the PLB, I understood that the warning was not about what the gorge might do. The warning was that by the time you're in a position to read it, the gorge has already heard everything there is to hear. It already knows what it wants. And it has already decided.